coach and teacher trainer. Came to Birmingham for a brief time at Spring Valley School there, and loved my time in Birmingham. Met some marvelous people from Alabama, and that's led me to here. This is the path that has led me to here. The consistent thing throughout has been the children and the need, and the fact that it's a challenging field. It's a field that is incredibly rewarding because we can open doors, and that's why I do what I do still. That's more than I would like sometimes. But it's been a big week. We had parent conferences yesterday at our school, and I'm leaving tomorrow for the SACE conference in Atlanta. And how many of you are going to the International Dyslexia Association conference in Chicago? Okay. If you haven't gotten to go to one of those, I highly recommend it. It is a marvelous, marvelous experience. And that's where you can go meet the people who write the books that you've been reading. And I've had the opportunity to do that over the years. I'm so glad Susan Hall is coming to Alabama. And these people are people who can bring to us their experience. So, moving right ahead. One of the things I like to do is set a groundwork for what we talk about dyslexia. Where did all this come from? Because there has been so much controversy around dyslexia over the years. What is it? Defining what it is, helping the public know what it is, helping people know what to do about it. So I want to start off and give you kind of a background from where all this came from. Because over the years we have theorized about reading in the field of education a lot. And a lot of people have thought for many years that reading is a simple act. All you have to do is let's try this. I'm pushing the left side of the, I'm pushing the arrow, I'm pushing the left and right. Oh, so yes. In your handout, there is the next slide says, this is a quote that I have used for many years, and actually this is, I believe this is in the front of the recipe for reading manual.
Is that it?
Yes, what did you do?
I just pressed that little arrow.
Oh, should I do it now? Okay, it doesn't seem to be doing it from here, so maybe I need to go.
Just tell me when.
Okay, all right. Or I can go stand there. Okay. Reading is the most complex neurological task a person undertakes in his lifetime. That human beings are able to read at all is a miracle. Yet most of us are able to do so effortlessly that we fail to realize how difficult it is. This has been the problem, because we see people picking up reading quite easily. For those of us who were able to read and spell easily, we don't understand what's wrong in those people who aren't able to do that. But what we are learning is how neurologically complex reading is. Next. This is a quote from John Steinbeck, who was himself dyslexic. Some people there are who, being grown, forget the horrible task of learning to read. It is perhaps the greatest single effort that the human undertakes, and he must do it as a child. We put this big, huge task on the shoulders of our smallest children. In the next slide, I want to talk about the stages of reading development that have been considered the groundwork of how we see reading develop over time. And the person who set this was Dr. Jean Shaw. How many of you know Dr. Jean Shaw's name? Okay, Dr. Jean Shaw has died in the last, 15 years, probably 10 to 15 years. She was the head of the reading center at Harvard University. And she wrote a book in the mid-60s called Learning to Read, The Great Debate. And is that the one? Yeah. Anyway, Her stages of reading start out with emergent literacy, and she developed these stages early on. So that in pre-reading stages in the early, very beginning, we call it now emergent literacy, we're talking about basically birth through age 6. And the next stage that you have is the stage where you start figuring out the code, those, as I always have called them, those balls and sticks on the page that are supposed to represent speech sounds. And you start figuring out that secret code in first and second grade, usually ages 6 to 7. It begins earlier than that if you're in preschool and you're exposed to it, but that's when you really get down to business in school. And then in grades 2 to 3, ages 7 to 8, we're confirming and we're smoothing it out. And we're basically in those stages up through 3rd grade learning to read. And then after 3rd grade, we turn to the what stage? Reading to learn. How many of you heard that over and over again? Thank you, Dr. Gina Shaw. That's where it came from. If you didn't know that, now you do. But that means that in the normally developing reading stages, we are assuming that children are on their way by 4th grade. And we know for a fact that that is not true for a significant portion of our population. In the next slide, I did a visual. Now, because of the number of slides I have, you may figure out that I'm a visual learner. But I have this rubric in my brain, and that is how we shift in our instructional emphasis. And if you were to take a slice of this picture, if you were to cut down through, up through 1st grade, and you were to slice up this way, the emphasis is on basic reading skills. First, 0, 1, 2, 3, and then we put emphasis on reading comprehension more and more as we progress through school. And that's how we conceptualize our curriculum in reading as well, in the normally developing child. What happens is that in those stages of reading, what happens to our individuals who are dyslexic? What happens to them? They get to grade 3, and where are they? Have they gotten to that part? Have they gotten to that stage? Yes. And if you can go back to that stage in that slide before, where do they get stuck? In that decoding stage, stage 1, they get stuck there at varying degrees. Some students can, who have very high IQ, very high vocabulary, lots and lots of verbal skills, can fool you because they can guess a lot, and they can put in words, and they can figure out helicopter and parachute. They just can't read word. And but what happens is their spelling is abysmal. And if you really want to know how much a child has developed an inner sense of the sound system of language, you look at their spelling, because that's really the core. And if you really want to look at it, you look at their reading of nonsense words and their spelling of nonsense words. That is why it reflects what's going on in their inner process. Now, what have we done in education to address reading? Can you skip over a couple of slides? And we have what I call, and people have referred to in the field of education, as the pendulum effect. You may get what I'm getting at right away, or you may not. But what I want to tell you is this. I have another presentation I did at International Dyslexia Association several years called Dick and Jane Learn Rocket Science. And I did a history of reading instruction in America and went back and studied all of the methods that we used and all of the methods that we still use in our country. And basically what Reed Lyon has said to us out of the NICHD Research Center, he has said reading instruction in America has been like a religion over the years. that if you ask a teacher, are you into phonics or are you into whole language, they will say, what method do you believe in? And it's like a religion. You kind of ascribe to a theory. And these different methods of teaching reading come from the fact that we didn't have science to base it on. We were theorizing about how reading develops and developing methods to approach that. Back in the horn book stages of early America, when we had little paddles that we taught reading from, the students would recite the alphabet, and they would do syllable recitation, and they would do a lot of copying. And in the history, even back in the Roman times, they would talk about how copying, a lot of people learned to read just by copying text, because we didn't have printers and they just spelled a lot. So we had a lot of recitation and saying the alphabet and just looking at syllable patterns and reciting those. We have what we call the sentence method, and that is where we look at meaning. We just read sentences and read sentences and read sentences, and we pass over them until you get them. We have the whole word method, which is basically the sight word approach. That was the Dick and Jane series, because we had flashcards with sight words, and those were controlled vocabulary. And this Dick and Jane series had a controlled vocabulary, which we have very few of today, in the form that we did with Dick and Jane. And what they learned from the Dick and Jane series was a lot of children weren't learning that way. And after they came out with the very first series, they added phonics workbooks after that. But there is a phonics method. Phonics is basically a teaching method. So when you say phonics, you're talking about linking the letters to the sounds. So we teach phonetic or phonics that way. I grew up in a mix of sight word and phonics. My brother had pure sight words. My brother is very dyslexic, and it made his issues much worse in school. And then in the 80s, we came out with the whole language method. And the whole language method basically assumes, and this is what the theory assumes, that you lay down reading patterns like we lay down language. It's a naturally progressing process. If students listen to it long enough, it will sink in and you will hear the patterns and you will connect. And that's kind of the basis of the pure whole language method. So we do have still a mix of those going on in America. And I want to talk about the fact that why some of those do not reach our children. So I want to move on to our personal stories section. And this I added when I spoke to a group of parents in Kansas City, where I was before I came here. And I talk about, on the next slide, what we dream for our children. And I guess I have a little animation on that, so if you click it again. When a child is born, or even before a child is born now, parents start reading to their children. And that message has gotten across loudly and clearly in America. That's one thing that has gone up tremendously in the past 10 years, is that all stages of, and all levels of socioeconomic groups have gotten that message. It's been a successful campaign to tell people, read to your children. And go ahead and click on the rest of those, which has put all of them up there. There are 4 or 5 of them. What we are trying to do is build in, of course, not only skill, but if you look at this all of these, there's a sense of what kind of emotion are you getting from those pictures, may I ask? Wonder. Okay. Oh, pardon? Togetherness, kind of warm, fuzzy. Books are a source of even humor. Maybe the little girl at the top is reading to learn, and then the boys in the center are probably reading some ghost story or something. So we're talking about, the dream is to eventually build in such fluid reading ability that it opens up the book and the ideas pop out. In the next slide, I think this captures what reading feels like for our students who are dyslexic, and that is the knitted brow, the puzzled look. Those words are not popping out. And this begins very early for our children. And these are children for whom intelligence is there, all of their visual systems are intact, their hearing is intact, and they are not learning to read. And at that point, in the next slide, what we have is a bunch of teachers at school poring over, looking at the child, trying to figure out how to help. And across this country, this happens in every single school. Teachers are trying very, very hard to find answers for children. And at home, in the next slide, this is what happens at night. They start out with somebody, helping with homework, and homework goes on for hours and hours and hours. And between the tears and the anger and the fatigue, this is what happens. And many of our children are struggling, we know that. What it feels like to parents sometimes is my little cartoon. It's supposed to be funny, but it's halfway funny. The feds have authorized me to leave your child behind. That's what it feels like. You know something's happening, and you know that something is amiss, and they're falling behind, and it's scary. So I want to move on to the next part, and that is, what do we know about reading? So we talked about theory, we talked about ideas, and in the next slide, I want to talk about when we have, this is out of some of the earlier studies and then a national panel, the reading panel report that came out. But between 1884 and 1910, we had only 34 studies, basically, that were reported in our sources of what really goes on with reading, looking at reading. Before 1966, that would be all up until then, what happened in the early 20s was the term remedial reading was developed in the early 20s. And it developed because in World War I, one of the things that we found was a lot of the soldiers could not read the manuals to operate the military, in the military manuals. And that started, after World War I, a really big emphasis on what is going on, because we have all these kids graduating from high school, getting their 8th grade certificates or whatever, and yet they cannot read. And it was the first time as a country we became very alarmed at what was going on. And in the schools of education and in the universities, we started studying reading disorders, but it started with adults. And we developed a lot of studies up until 15,000 studies before 1966. What happened between World War I and 1966? Something big. Similar baby boom. When did baby boom happen? After World War II. And World War II, we had a bunch of soldiers going into the military, and guess what? The same percentage of those individuals were not learning to read. And then we had the baby boom. What else happened in the 50s that scared us about our educational system? Pardon? Yeah, there was a book that came out by Rudolph Flesch called Why Johnny Can't Read. And basically, that was the scare. Now, that came out after another scare we had in the 50s. Sputnik, thank you, Rocket City. Okay, when Sputnik came out and the Russians launched their satellite, there was a huge emphasis and basically, what are we doing? What's going to happen? So we have all these political and cultural things happening in our country, and we're finding that the same number of children were not able to read. So that's where Jean Shaw comes in. Jean Shaw was commissioned by the government to study reading across the world and methodologies. And what happened was in 1966-65, her book came out, and that was Learning to Read, the Great Debate. Now, what was the Great Debate at that time? What were people debating about? What did Rudolph Flesch say in his book? If anybody has read it or studied it. Rudolph Flesch wrote a book and said, basically, our educational system is in the toilet. He was very, very, very inflammatory. He was the Rush Limbaugh, I guess, of, the kind of the very emotional writer of the age. And he said, basically, we're missing the boat, guys. We're not teaching them right. That was in this Dick and Jane sight word approach era. And he said, we need to be teaching phonics. And so Jean Shaw said, okay, let's look at this, basically. And in the end of her book, she basically said, and I don't think I have that quote in this presentation, but she basically said, what we need is both. That was in 1966 in her book. We need, early on especially, every child needs some explicit teaching of sounds in the sound system. They need to understand there's a system underneath all of this. And they need lots of reading and connected text, lots of rich reading experiences. And what's the term that we use for that now? We call that the balanced approach, I guess. But, you know, what we know is that was what our research all has been telling us all along. Then, after 1966 to now, look what happened. We had an explosion of research. And that's because of this next thing. After Jean Shaw's book came out, Congress said, okay, what are we going to do about it? And they mandated the National Institute of Child Health and Development, NICHD, to research reading development, reading disorders, and reading instruction. And in the next slide, it shows you a little bit, it's not updated, but these are the centers where this research, these are just some of the centers. It involved university settings, school districts, clinics throughout the nation. And at the time that I made this slide, which was probably a good 5 or 6 years ago at least, at that point, they had studied 43,000 individuals in different ways. They're looking at genetics, neurology, instructional methods, good readers, how do they develop reading and how does it break down. And in the mid-1980s, specifically, NICHD started looking at dyslexia specifically. And they defined it and they started to study it. And what happened out of that is, in the next slide, we have many books and many publications that came out. One of them came out in 1998, Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children. What's the key word in this book? Preventing. This is the first publication that came out and said, wait, you do not have to wait until they're in 3rd and 4th grade to identify them. We don't have to wait until they fail. We can literally intervene at the pre-reading level and start doing this, because this is what our research settings have shown us. And we moved from fixing it after it's broken to really looking at it before it even starts. In 2000 or 2001, the National Reading Panel was a group of individuals then that reviewed all of the research and came up with a huge document. It's about this thick. And they said, this is what we've found. And they came out with generally, I mean, I could go into this, there's a lot to be said about it, but in the next slide, what basically came out of it that has impacted our programs across this nation is that they broke reading down into 5 big ideas or 5 components that we need to consider when we're looking at reading and learning to read. And that's the phonological awareness part. Does the child have underlying understanding of the sounds of language? How are they doing with their phonics development? How well are they doing with connecting those letter sounds with the letters with the sounds and the patterns? Are they fluent? Do they have a good vocabulary? How's their vocabulary coming? And how about comprehension? Now, you may think of this as a hierarchy, which in some ways it's a rough hierarchy, but what our research has proven is that it doesn't progress in that singular way. It intermingles, and phonics instruction does drive phonological awareness. And we work on fluency at all levels. We work on vocabulary at all levels. And then, of course, the comprehension is basically building connections while you read. Comprehension is building connections in your head as you're reading so that you're understanding what's happening. So in the next slide, basically what the research told us, I made this slide for me, the visual learner, from one of Reed Lyon's reports to Congress, and this is held up pretty much statistically. We know that, I don't care what it is, if we talk about blue eyes, brown eyes, weight, the age, whatever it is, statistically, we tend to get a bell curve when we look at things. We have fewer people at one end, fewer people at the other, and then we have a lot of people in the middle. Bell curve is a concept that we all have studied in statistics and education. And what we have in the field of reading is a bell curve of how students react to reading instruction. And what we have is, at the upper end of our bell curve, we find that for 5% of our population in general, this is every child in the country, all of us, 5% learn to read effortlessly without any instruction. They pick it up and go. And that's my old thing about, for people who have seen this in my presentations before, I always say, if you put a baby in a closet with a Time magazine and pull them out when they're in kindergarten and they'll read it to you, kind of thing. They're just in there. They just absorb it. It goes into their heads. 20 to 30% roughly of our population will learn to read using any type of instruction. So you give them a little bit of instruction and they learn to read. And I always say, thank goodness for that group my first year of teaching. Because if it hadn't been for that group, I probably wouldn't have gone back. But you do have those kids who do well. 60%, a major portion, have to have explicit instruction to start with to help them make the link that they will learn at an average rate. But you do have to give them a sniff or even a fairly good dose of explicit instruction in the way language is formed. 20 to 30% of our population, for that group, reading is the most difficult subject they will ever have in school. And then, even in research settings, 1 to 2% of our population have been so severe that they still have not learned to read in research settings. And that's why people have been frustrated who know anything about instruction, that we know that we have those children. We know that we have those children who cannot learn to read because they are so severe. Thank you. And that's the puzzling part, I think, for educators is this child one of those? Or is it me? That's always the question. But what we know is that the ones that don't learn to read are probably very, 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 very few. And I have yet to come across one in my 35-ish years in the field of learning disabilities, as far as in the public schools. But you can see, and this is what Sally Shaywitz says in her book, Overcoming Dyslexia, and the Yale Center has said this, like everything else, dyslexia falls on a spectrum of severity. So if you got down to the below the 10th percentile on tests, we're talking severe, more severe. And then we're talking about more intense intervention. And it does make a difference if they have other things going on, like attention problems, and can they be dyslexic and have Asperger's syndrome or a spectrum disorder? Yes, they can. And one of the things that we know is that you can be on the lower end of the average range of IQ test, in the 80s and 90s, and still be dyslexic. We used to say you had to have 90 or above. We know that that's not true because, for one thing, all IQ tests don't necessarily capture the ability of the child, that their dyslexia can affect their IQ testing. But anyway, this is something I really go back to help people understand why it is a spectrum disorder just like other disorders, and it can be more severe for some people. So
When we talk about dyslexia, and I'm talking to the choir here, but the one thing we talk about is, what is it? Before they could research it, they had to define it. So let's go to the definition. There's a reason why there are yellow words in there. And why would that be? Because there's a lot of verbiage in this definition, but these are the concepts you need to pull out. It is neurobiological in origin. We know now that dyslexic brains look and function differently, and it is biologically based. And neuro means in the brain. What it's characterized by: difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor spelling and decoding abilities. And then, I know for those of you who have been in this field not as long as I have, that this is like a duh, but this is actually the huge new information of the century. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. What does that mean? It means that it is not a vision problem, it's not a hearing problem, it is a brain-based problem where perceiving sounds and managing the sounds of language in our brains is fuzzy. They hear it, they just can't make sense of it. And it's like kind of where I am with my hearing right now. I can hear it. I know you said something, but some of those consonants fall out at this point. And the big one is it's unexpected given their cognitive abilities, their exposures, to the classroom instruction. It's not in keeping with what we would expect from that child. What happens is then we have problems in reading comprehension. If you can't read the words, you can't comprehend. Then you don't read as much, so you have reduced experience. You don't acquire the vocabulary that other children acquire when they read 1 million words a year and you read 10,000. And over time, background knowledge, vocabulary does not grow at the same rate, which affects comprehension, which can also affect driving your reading. But what it isn't, what do you not see on this screen that people think about when they think about dyslexia in general? Okay, reversals. Reversed letters. There's nothing in here that says this child has to reverse letters. It is a separate issue. It can coexist. And but you can reverse letters up through age 8 and still be within the norm of developmental stages. You look at other things along with letter reversals. Okay, moving right along. Here's the simple version, basically, on the next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Basically, what you have is an individual who can't read words fluently and spell words and remember how to spell words well. I get calls, when I was doing diagnostic work all those years. Well, I don't think my child is dyslexic because you know what? She gets 100% on her spelling test every week. So the next question is, that's right, does she remember them the next week? Well, no. What is that child relying on? That child is relying on visual memory, short-term memory. But it's not, that child has not internalized the sound system of language.
Am I with you or am I falling behind?
You're with me, you're with me. Major cause of dyslexia next. Back to this. It's reduced awareness or sensitivity to the speech sound structure of language. Now this is kind of interesting because I was a baby teacher. I hadn't been out there, I was green, wet behind the ears, whatever you call it, neophyte, any of those things. And when I moved into working with these children, my mother is a master teacher who's taught for years and years, and I said, she tutored until she was 85, so I said, I don't know if that's good or bad news for me. But anyway, I told her when I first started teaching these children, I said 2 things. I said, you know what I notice is that I have to wait longer for the answers in my little resource room when I bring them in. If I ask a question, I notice that if I just sit with my hands in my lap, very often they'll come up with the answer. But the wait time is longer. Number 2, I went to our speech language person, and this was again in the early 70s, and I said, is there anything in your speech research about the fact that children can hear sounds but they don't seem to understand them? And she said no. Because that research didn't come out even in the speech and language field until the early 80s. This is the new news about reading disorders, and that is that the major cause is that lack of perception of understanding sound. So we call that, in the next slide, when we talk about individual speech sounds, we're talking about phonemes. So cat is made up of 3 speech sounds. If you were a linguist, 3 speech sounds, act. And so they notice, think about, and work with individual speech sounds and spoken words. When children first learn to read, they look at words like they're pictures. And so that's why the sight word approach, works initially, and that is a good starter for early readers, because they can say, that's why Dick and Jane worked nicely for a lot of children, because there was a lot of repetition. They saw those words over and over again, and we learned them as whole units. And that was what I learned when I did the preschool early reading first grants in the public schools, that children really treat words like pictures. And I remember testing an adult who is now actually one of our colleagues in the dyslexia circles when we go to the conferences. I tested her. She came to Menninger in Topeka, and she is now a trainer of teachers. And she said, when I was in 3rd grade, I went home one day and I opened up the dictionary and I burst into tears because I thought I had to memorize every word in that book, and I knew I couldn't do it. So before they learn to read print, they need to become aware of how sounds in words work. They have to start breaking them down. In the next slide, we're talking about the fact that these phonological core deficits can happen in the awareness of sounds, in the storage of sounds in your brain, and in the retrieval. So that's why we have children who say words like, I had a college student come, I was testing, she was going back into nursing school, and she said, I used to call it remedial math instead of remedial math. And they'll say words like macaroni instead of macaroni, or biscuit. We've talked about that, getting syllables mixed up. My father-in-law, who is a retired Baptist preacher, cannot for the life of him say the word ibuprofen. And he cannot get, he's been a speaker all his life, but he does get his syllables mixed up. So, I'm going to go over this next slide fairly quickly, but on individual speech sounds and language. But, basically, if I ask you to say the word no, if you want to say no, okay, how many sounds did you make? Okay, oh, how many letters do you see? Okay. Let's go to the last 2. Stack. And say the word stack. How many sounds? Stack. How many letters? Okay. Next word. How many sounds? How many letters? Okay. This is why spelling is hard. Number 1, you all know how to segment sounds. So when a child learns to spell, if I say orally, this is when you have it right in front of you. This is a recognition task. The child has the word in front of him or her, and you say, what is that word? So they have to recognize it. They have to say those individual sounds based on those symbols. But take away the page and say, how do you spell stack? That's a production task. They have to retrieve those sounds and pull them back out and fix them on the letters. That is harder. And that's why spelling is harder to remediate than reading, because it's a harder cognitive task. Okay, next. And I always say, when I first evaluate in the individual, especially adults, I say, just remember that This is not connected to intelligence. This college student wrote this on the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement Test. In spite of his success in the area of quantum physics, Stephen Hawking still considers himself a mere researcher. Is there anything wrong with this guy's brain? As far as concepts, vocabulary, could look at the spelling. Next, here's a 5th grader. Summer school in Topeka, Kansas. Dear Dad, this was the first week of June, of summer school. Well, Dad, the teacher said to write something positive. We got popsicles on Friday. Well, the teacher is going to read this, so I guess mean and ugly is out. I think I should have erased that. Put the exclamation point. Perfectly verbal 5th grade girl. She went on to star in theater, the community theater, and have a theater scholarship at college, but very dyslexic. Has picked up a lot of what's going on, and this is what really kills people, because she can spell a lot of the words, but of erased is one word to her, and that she has not broken that down into 2 words even. What we know is, we're going to move right along, what science has helped us understand is our science is catching up with what we've observed in children all along. In the Yale Center, and several of our NICH centers around the country, they're doing functional MRIs. And what that means is it's a non-invasive way of looking at a brain. Now this is, the little history behind this was that one of the very first research projects that the Dyslexia Association funded was Al Galaberta at Harvard, and he was doing research on autopsies on brains and looking at dyslexic brains versus regular readers in the mid-'80s. And he was coming up with differences in the brain structure. But as somebody said, we have to wait till they die till we can diagnose it. So no, we have to be able to do better than that. So they were looking at functional fMRIs, and what they found in a short, and some of you already know this stuff, so I will pass through this fairly quickly. But what we saw in the next slide came out of the Yale Center, and that is reading takes place in a lot of areas of the brain, but mainly the phonological processing, the word meaning part, and the letter identification part of the brain. If you were looking at a person, the forehead is up there, the ear is, in that fold there, and the back of the brain, the visual center, is where you identify the letters. And those are the areas that are lining up the most. We have another study that just showed that, we have structural differences in dyslexic brains as well. And in the next slide, we can see that they now can compare the left hemisphere of a normal reader and the left hemisphere of a child with reading difficulties. And you can see that the left hemisphere, the language section of the brain, is not utilized as much. But what we see in the next slide, and this is what's the big news, after 1 year of intervention, this is, and it's kind of confusing because it flips around if I remember, the left hemisphere is on that side of the slide. This was the child in kindergarten. We're looking at and this is the area of the brain we want to light up. And after 1 year of appropriate multisensory instruction, it changes. This same child is now utilizing the portions of the brain that looks like a normal reader. And this has been replicated in children and adults. If you would look at the next slide, what we look at is, with early on, these children have trouble recognizing letters, they don't rhyme easily, difficulty listing words that begin with the same sound, weak spelling. I'm not going to read all this to you, but these are the characteristics of what we look for early on. In the next slide, I just want to say that what we call it when we're done sometimes depends on who you go to. What we know that under the umbrella of what we call learning disabilities, our research has pretty much shaken out that 80% are dyslexic or have language-based learning disabilities. Learning disability is an educational term. Dyslexia is a term that's been used in the clinical side as a subtype of a learning disability. And that's why we're fighting so hard to get the term used in our public schools. So we now know that we can define dyslexia this way and call it that. It helps us to be a little more precise in how we treat it. In the public schools, however, we are moving, and this is what I always tell people, public schools do not diagnose. They don't diagnose ADHD, they don't diagnose schizophrenia, they don't diagnose a lot of things. But we have those kids in our schools. What do? We serve them, and we put them in a program, and that's the difference. So we, right now, that's our model. So when we go to schools and we say, I want you to serve my child has dyslexia, it puts the public school at a disadvantage because they can't call it that. I mean, they have to recognize what you're saying, but then they have their programs that they have to go through to get services for a child. You know what I mean? So in some ways, we just have a clash of systems in what we're asking. And we need to know that. So when we go to schools, we know how to work within the system that they have. We have a lot of people in our schools who can help our children. What we do know, however, is there's not a pill for this. This is neurobiological. It's not a disease that you can cure. But the primary intervention, next slide, is educational. And the reason the International Dyslexia Society is here today is because of this next person, Samuel Torrey Orton, who was a doctor who was working in the Midwest in the early part of the century, in the 30s, and was taking information from studies done in Europe, looking at these bright individuals who were not learning to read, and trying to figure out from a clinical aspect what is going on. He was a neurologically trained individual, went on to work at Harvard. But out of his studies, then, we have some people who popped up next. And I realize there's a typo on this slide. 1943 was appropriate for Grace Bernal, but Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman, that is 1936, not 1946. So X that out, and I meant to change that last night. I don't know how long I've been running around with that one. But anyway, Bessie Stillman and Anna Gillingham worked side by side with Samuel Orton and came up with a method that addresses what's going on in the brain in dyslexia. And because I'm in Alabama, this next slide takes on special meaning because Samuel Orton was influenced a lot by Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan because he's thinking to himself, okay, we have a very bright individual who learned how to read and spell and communicate in a symbolic language, and she could not hear, and she could not see, but still she learned. So what he surmised is, obviously, language gets in and out of the brain in different modalities, and if one or the other is weak, what we need to do is strengthen that modality and all the modalities so that they can receive this information and make connections. So in the next one, this originated in the 1930s, and the International Dyslexia Association was the Orton Dyslexia Society until 1990-something, 98, 99. It was called the Orton Society. And basically what this is then is a very direct, very structured, cumulative, multisensory approach to teaching language structure. It is not just phonics. It teaches phonetics, vocabulary,